The UK Modern Slavery Act of 2015 was established 7 years ago and was hailed as a pioneering landmark piece of legislation. However, the analysis of its results after 7 years are, while disappointing, very instructive and will allow the introduction of corrective measures by the international community. An example of an analysis of the present UK legislation, the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre report 2021, entitled Modern Slavery Act, 5 Years of Reporting Conclusions from Monitoring Corporate Disclosure, states the following, quote, the provisions of the UK Act itself, based on a requirement to submit a trifling level of reporting which has not been monitored or enforced, has failed to drive systemic corporate action to expunge forced labor, even in high-risk sectors. The Act has raised awareness of the prevalence of modern slavery and encouraged a cluster of leading companies and investors to do more. But ultimately, our analysis of 5 years' worth of statements in the Modern Slavery Registry has revealed no significant improvements in the vast majority of companies' policies, practice, or performance. Instead, lack of enforcement of the reporting requirement itself and lack of mandatory reporting criteria has led to dismal results. End of quote. In tonight's webinar, we will base our discussion on a recent expert report entitled An Opportunity for Impact Report, Recommendations for Regulating Modern Slavery in Supply Chains to the New Zealand Government, introduced by Dame Sara Thornton, DPA QBM, then UK's Independent Slavery Commissioners, which offers very clear recommendations to more efficiently enforce supply chain controls. This report, available online, modernslaveryrecommendations.nz, and in the handouts of this webinar. Dame Sara Thornton, in her introduction to this document, emphasized that, I quote, while modern slavery is perpetrated by criminals, human traffickers, and ruthless opportunists, it is enabled by lax governance, ignorance, aggressive commercial practices. While legislation is no silver bullet, it is the most powerful method of forcing greater corporate responsibility at scale. End of quote. The report underlines that a recent shift among international experts, instigated by the apparent lack of effectiveness with purely self-regulatory mechanisms, encourages the introduction of new legal mechanisms to go forward from a voluntary to prescriptive or mandatory approach. But now, the second speaker, an author of the report, is Rebekah Armstrong. Rebekah Armstrong, one of the authors of the report, human rights practitioner with 14 years experience specializing in modern slavery, human rights, and humanitarian law. She is the Director of Business and Human Rights Consultants and Head of the Advocacy and Justice at World Vision. Rebekah is Chair of the New Zealand Human Rights Research Coalition, responsible for publishing the first research on worker exploitation in New Zealand. She is an advisory member of the New Zealand Centre for Research on Modern Slavery and a member of the Modern Slavery Leadership Advisory Group to the New Zealand government. Rebekah, thanks for being with us tonight, also early in the morning for you, because you're speaking from New Zealand, and I'm so happy and grateful to give you the floor. Please.
Thank you. Ina mana, ina reo, ina karangataha maha. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. All authorities, voices, all gathered here today. Greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak to our paper, An Opportunity for Impact. This paper was drafted by Natalia, Rebecca Kingy, Quinton Lake, and I. We published it when the New Zealand government opened for consultation on a modern slavery law proposal at the end of April this year. And our purpose in drafting this paper was to present key recommendations New Zealand modern slavery law could or should encompass. The authors believe that New Zealand has a unique opportunity to design and implement a regulatory system that's set up for success, and the recommendations outlined in this paper are unique to New Zealand's geopolitical and cultural context, but they also recognise international developments. The review of the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act was published after our report, and many of the review questions relate to recommendations we've put forward in this paper, which makes our report valid for New Zealand and Australia. And we're pleased to see that this has been of use to some of our Australian colleagues. Now, 6 months on from writing the report, we still stand by the recommendations we've put forward and still think that these should form the basis of New Zealand law. I want to thank Dame Sara Thornton for her engagement with our paper and for her comments. One of our recommendations is that an independent anti-slavery commissioner is needed, and it's clear that Dame Sara has played such an integral role in the context of the UK. It's fantastic to see her endorsement of the development of this law in other jurisdictions. This evening I'm going to outline some of the key recommendations we've set out to form the basis of modern slavery law in New Zealand. But first I'll give a little overview of the current legislative landscape in New Zealand with regard to addressing modern slavery, and an overview of key events that have led to a draft law currently being underway. I'm going to speak to features of the proposed law that are different from other similar modern slavery legislation and address what some of the sticking points are in terms of the recommendations made in the report with regard to the current political landscape. If you can go to slide 2, please. So why is modern slavery legislation needed in New Zealand? It's because there's a current gap in New Zealand's legislative landscape. New Zealand does not currently regulate broader operations and supply chain practices that contribute to exploitation and modern slavery. Despite this, we know that modern slavery is taking place in New Zealand as it is everywhere in the world, as Dame Sara pointed out. A World Vision report on risky goods showed that $3.1 billion of imports associated with child labour and forced labour were brought into New Zealand in 2019, amounting to 5% of all of New Zealand's imports. New Zealand also has cases of human trafficking and slavery in our horticulture industry, involving seasonal migrant workers. New Zealand has a worker exploitation problem, with exploitation often nearing the definition of human trafficking and slavery taking place in a lot of our industries, including hospitality, retail, fishing, forestry, horticulture, international students. Some of our larger New Zealand companies report to the UK and Commonwealth Modern Slavery Acts, but New Zealand also has a unique makeup of companies, with 97% of our companies being small to medium-sized enterprises that employ around 30% of New Zealanders and generate 28% of our GDP. In terms of the UNGPs, the New Zealand government has committed to carrying out a national action plan on business and human rights, but made no real progress on this. I think it's fair to say that many New Zealand companies are behind the rest of the world when it comes to embedding a human rights perspective that goes beyond mere compliance with the law. And so while there's been some progress in recent years with the government using public procurement as a tool to encourage New Zealand business to respect human rights, most companies don't have a strong understanding of their supply chains and an understanding of how to address modern slavery and human rights within this. And this is why modern slavery legislation is so important. Through regulating expectations for addressing and mitigating modern slavery and supply chains, it will in turn assist companies to carry out this practice. Slide 3. Our report sets out a timeline of key events in Aotearoa relating to regulating modern slavery in supply chains at page 7. You'll see it's been a busy few years in New Zealand, and there's a natural momentum taking place for this legislation. I'll briefly outline some of the key events in slide 4. In March 2021, the government released the New Zealand Plan of Action against forced labour, people trafficking and slavery. This said that the government would consider legislation requiring business to report publicly on transparency in supply chains to help eliminate practices of human trafficking. On the same day, an open letter signed by over 100 New Zealand companies was presented to the government, and it asked the minister to commence an inquiry into a Modern Slavery Act for New Zealand business and public sector supply chains. In June 2021, a public petition signed by 37,000 New Zealanders was presented to Parliament, asking the government to introduce modern slavery legislation. You can see that civil society has had a large impact on where this law, on requesting this law from the onset. In March 2022, the Petitions Committee report urged the government to bring legislation addressing modern slavery before the House as soon as possible, while allowing for adequate policy development and public consideration. In April 2022, the government launched a public consultation on proposals for modern slavery and worker exploitation law in New Zealand. Slide 5. So a summary of feedback from the consultation was published in October, and you can read this online. I won't go into this, only to emphasize a few pretty interesting points. We had 5,625 submissions received throughout the consultation process. I think this shows really good engagement from New Zealanders for modern slavery law. In summary, there was strong support. Around 90% of people, of submitters, endorsed the proposed legislation objectives and graduated approach, whereby all New Zealand entities, including not-for-profits, the public sector, would have responsibilities to take reasonable and proportionate action to address modern slavery. I guess a key point here is that this law would apply to small, medium and large businesses, which is a point of difference as well. Submitters were supportive of the revenue thresholds set out, with a large company defined as $50 million New Zealand dollars and medium $20 million. This is significantly lower than the UK and Commonwealth financial thresholds, and this equates to around UK 25 million pounds and Australian dollars 46 million for large companies. Submitters were generally happy with worker exploitation being included in the law, and this is another very key point of difference to the Australian and UK law. The New Zealand law proposes that worker exploitation should be addressed in domestic supply chains, whereas the other acts have a focus on modern slavery, the slavery definitions. Submitters also generally supported robust due diligence protocols. The proposal outlined that a graduated approach to due diligence would take place with large companies and small and medium companies that are parent holding companies or have significant contractual control carrying out due diligence. Many submitters agreed that non-compliance should be penalised proportionately to a company's size, and they supported an independent oversight mechanism, a central register, and comprehensive support and guidance to accompany any law. Slide 6. So where are we up to now? A draft law is underway, and we're hoping that this may be presented to the House of Representatives by the end of the year. I think it's fair to say that the draft law is fairly progressive and has had input from the Modern Slavery Leadership Advisory Group. So there's been a very robust process in terms of strong expertise feeding into the modern slavery law proposals for New Zealand, and there's been a lot of engagement with business and with civil society. New Zealand has an election coming up in September 2023, and it does feel like there's a lot of momentum to get this law over the line before then, especially because so much great work has taken place under this government, and it's unclear what a change of government would mean for this legislation. The opposition National Party released a private member's bill for a Modern Slavery Act at the time of consultation in April of this year. It was very similar to the Commonwealth Modern Slavery Act before its review, so very similar to the Act before these potential proposals and reviews have been set out. And it presented a much more conservative proposal that didn't take into account global developments taking place. I guess there's a small fear that a change of government might mean that some of the progress on this law could be stagnated. If you could go to slide 7, please. I'm now going to briefly touch on 3 recommendations from our report. So the first one is that our report says that entities captured by this legislation should all entities should be captured by this legislation. So the public sector and not-for-profit, small, medium and large companies should be affected with a proportionate approach based on their risk profile. This means when looking at the level of obligations, the sector of activity, risk profile, business model, nature of operations, products and services should be considered. Slide 8, transparency. We outlined that transparency in supply chains should be a key feature of New Zealand modern slavery law. This is where the risk of modern slavery in supply chain is identified and publicly disclosed. Transparency and disclosure is really important because it raises awareness of modern slavery and provides information to the public and the market, including investors, that can assist with business engagement. It also assists in showing improvements in a company's practice that can be measured over time. Obviously, transparency is a prerequisite to human rights due diligence. However, alone, transparency and disclosure, we say, is an incomplete and inadequate strategy for addressing modern slavery in supply chain because it places no onus on companies to address modern slavery, only to identify it. A recent report just published by our government outlined that in the context of New Zealand, transparency provisions are necessary but unlikely to give business and public sector organisations enough incentive to move beyond a minimum compliance approach to the issues. The report further goes on to say that enforcement, penalties and due diligence provisions may counter the weakness of transparency in supply chain provisions. Transparency in supply chain has been a really strong feature of UK and Commonwealth Acts, and we say that this needs to be a central feature of New Zealand Act, but the New Zealand Act needs to go further. Slide 9, mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence. I know Natalia is very keen to speak to this as well, so I'll just make a few comments here. Our report outlines that mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence should be followed, focusing on both human rights and environmental risks. We did have some feedback from some of our peer reviewers that said that we should potentially leave out the environmental aspect as it's too wide of an ask and would most probably not be considered by the government. And we accept this and note that environmental due diligence is not within the ambit of the current government proposals. However, we were keen to propose what New Zealand's model law should look like. And if there was more time, if there was more opportunity for policy coherence amongst all of New Zealand laws, then mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence is what we should be aiming for. It has a much larger scope of application than modern slavery legislation because it encompasses the regulation of modern slavery specific practices as well as protection from violations of other human rights and environmental norms. And in making this recommendation, we were looking at proposals in the EU. We were thinking about policy coherence with overseas regulations and the potential issue of New Zealand companies having to report to a number of regulations that set out different expectations, which could potentially be problematic and burdensome. And we were also looking at the unique context of Aotearoa New Zealand, which has a very strong culture of addressing sustainability and environmental impacts. So as I've noted earlier, while New Zealand may be behind in addressing human rights through supply chains and through corporate practices, New Zealand entities are ahead in terms of addressing the environment. In fact, we've already started legislating mandatory environmental due diligence through a recent law, the Financial Sector Climate-Related Disclosures and Other Matters Act, which assists the financial sector to meet obligations to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. We predict there'll be more mandatory environmental due diligence to come for New Zealand, so we thought it made sense to put this together with mandatory human rights due diligence in the context of modern slavery because these are complementary. In terms of human rights due diligence, we think that this should be in accordance with the UNGP so that entities have to identify, prevent, mitigate and account for how they address human rights in global and domestic supply chains. Recent research from Australia shows that companies are not doing human rights due diligence well. with 40% of companies assessed being non-compliant. This indicates that a more prescriptive approach to human rights due diligence may be required in law with accompanying guidance. I think it's important to note that responsibilities to identify, prevent, mitigate for, and account for addressing human rights in supply chains generally relate to concepts such as meaningful and direct stakeholder engagement, collaboration with other entities that have similar supply chains, strategic decision-making at board level being normalized for modern slavery, and providing workers to be part of providing solutions for identification and mitigation. As outlined earlier, it looks like New Zealand's modern slavery law proposal will put an onus on large companies and parent companies with contractual control to carry out human rights due diligence of their supply chains, and we do support this. That is my little summary of 3 key points.
I must say, I would have 2 questions, and possibly would be happy to hear again Rebekah on this. And those 2 questions would be, first, what are the chances of success of your recommendations in New Zealand and in other countries? And the second question, how do you see the role of consumers? You see, I don't know. May I ask Rebekah to say a word about this, and then back to Natalia?
Sure. I think a lot of the recommendations that we've put forward in our proposal are being taken into consideration in the current proposal that's being drafted in New Zealand, particularly around entities, penalties, anti-slavery commission or independent oversight mechanism, and the due diligence requirements for larger companies. Transparency in supply chain, I think a lot of these key points have been taken into consideration, or at least have been quite rigorously debated in the context of New Zealand as this proposal for law is being drafted. So I think the issues that we've raised in our report are issues that the whole world is grappling with. What entities should a Modern Slavery Act apply to? What should a financial threshold look like? What does proportionate? How should Modern Slavery Act apply proportionately? Should risk to sector and business be a consideration? These are key points that we've seen in the Australian review and in New Zealand, and I would say that a lot of the key points that we've put forward probably will be seen in New Zealand's legislation when it's finalised. One of the key points that we've raised that won't be is the human rights and environmental due diligence, because environment is not being considered in this particular law, but that's okay, because this law has a real focus on modern slavery, and we might see in years to come amendments to acts potentially as we understand more whether human rights due diligence is as effective as we think it might be. As Dame Sara Thornton outlined, and other academics have outlined as well, there is not a lot of research yet showing whether human rights due diligence is incredibly successful, and that information will come in years to come, I think, and we'll be looking for it readily.
Mm-hmm. And Rebekah, allow me to ask you again, do you see any role for consumers to press for any of your proposals, recommendations?
Yes, actually last year there was some research done on New Zealand consumers, and New Zealanders said that knowing a business treats its workers fairly is always, or most of the time, a key factor when deciding where to shop. So 50% of consumers in New Zealand said that understanding the practices of workers informed their decisions for where they shopped. So I think consumers have a really strong role in calling for stronger practices, demanding that the products that they use and buy are free from modern slavery. And I think there's more and more research needed to show what products are associated with modern slavery and give consumers the ability to be able to put that pressure on. And I think aspects of transparency and that where people can actually see a company's performance really aid in giving consumers that buying power and decision-making capability. So, yeah, I think consumers have a large role. And in terms of New Zealand and this particular legislation, we've seen so many Kiwis, so many New Zealanders really care about this legislation through signing the petition. 37,000 people signed that and making submissions. So it's very clear to us that New Zealanders are really concerned about modern slavery and that they want a modern slavery law so that they can feel like they are making the right decisions in how they carry out their business and consuming activity.
Thank you very much. Another question: how do business companies react to your proposals? Are they willing to go along, or are they resisting? Whatever. Let me say, it would be interesting to know more about the other side, I would say.
I was just looking at the feedback from the consultation, and 90% of submitters did say that they agreed with the proposals for modern slavery law in New Zealand, and a lot of the submissions did come from New Zealand companies. Some New Zealand companies are already reporting to the Australian and UK Act, and there's also implications when trading with the EU as well. New Zealand business, I think, is overly invested in modern slavery legislation. There was a letter signed by 100 New Zealand companies in support of this kind of legislation last year. And the 100 companies represented a lot of our large companies, but also a lot of our small to medium enterprises. And it was really representative of a very wide spectrum of business in New Zealand who are in support of this type of legislation. I think there are some key aspects of the legislation that business are wrestling with, and I think these are the things that we're discussing and debating at the moment. For example, obviously there's always concerns around the cost of implementing this kind of legislation, especially when a lot of New Zealand companies are small to medium enterprises. They might not have a large number of people working for the company, and so I think providing prescriptive guidance and tools that can assist companies to embed this kind of legislation without having to designate heaps of budget to it, making it as easy as possible, are some of the key ways that we can address business being more on board with this. But I would say overall, business are very supportive of these proposals in New Zealand, shown through that open letter and also the number of submissions that were put through from business very recently to the consultation proposal.
Would you like to say a few words in conclusion? Rebekah?
Thank you, Michelle. I'd just like to say a huge thank you for the invitation to speak and present our report today. A lot of time and thought went into our report, and we hope it's a resource that can be used in the EU and Australia, everywhere where modern slavery or supply chain legislation is being considered. I'd just like to thank again Dame Sara for her thoughts and her engagement with our work, and a big thank you to you, Michelle, for the incredible work that you're doing profiling work like ours, but also your mandate and everything that you're doing to further the development of this law and policy globally as well. Thank you very much.